Dust kicked up in the midday sun as the men circled tighter. The boy's limp slowed him down just enough that he couldn't shield the calf in time. A leather strap snapped across his shoulder, but he didn't cry out. He just gritted his teeth and leaned over the animal, thin arms wrapped around its trembling body like he could somehow take the blows for it. "Move, boy." "Or you'll get worse," one of them snapped. "I'm trying," the boy muttered, breath hitching. His left foot dragged awkwardly in the dirt, twisted slightly inward since birth. The way he hobbled made the men laugh. "God help us," said the tallest man, spitting into the dust. "Ain't no use beating the calf when the runt watching it can't even walk straight." "He's useless," another chimed in. "Ain't worth feeding." The boy didn't answer. His eyes, too old for 10, stayed fixed on the calf. It had fallen behind the herd, its legs weak from fever. He knew what that meant. So did the men. The kind thing would have been a bullet, but they weren't here to be kind. One of the ranch hands raised a coiled rope. "Move it, Crip." "Or I'll move you," then came the voice. "You're beating the wrong one." It was calm, deep, like thunder if thunder could feel tired. The men turned. He stood in the shadows of the stable, still as a church statue, broad as a barn wall. A leather vest stretched over his chest, dusty and cracked. His brown hat sat low over his eyes, shadowing a long scar that ran from his temple to his cheek. On his left forearm, half covered by rolled-up sleeve, inked feathers twisted with barbed wire. Elias Boone didn't repeat himself. The man with the rope hesitated. "Ain't your business, Boone." "It is now." The boy finally looked up. His lip bled where he'd bitten it. His eyes locked with Boone's. Something passed between them. Not words, just a kind of understanding. The kind only two people who've known pain without pity could share. Boone stepped forward. "Calf's mine now," he said simply. "You buying it?" "I'm taking it." That was the thing about Boone. He never threatened. He just declared, like it was already done. The men didn't argue. Not really. Not when Boone stared like that. They cursed under their breath and moved on. The boy still hadn't moved. Boone looked down at him. "Get up, son." The boy tried. His good leg braced, the other dragged. Boone reached down without asking and lifted him, just set him upright with one arm like he weighed nothing. "What's your name?" Boone asked. The boy blinked at him. "Henry." "You hungry, Henry?" He nodded. Boone looked at the calf, still lying in the dust. "Let's take her too." They didn't speak again as Boone loaded the calf onto his wagon and helped Henry up beside her. The boy sat stiffly, unsure what he was allowed to feel. The road out of town was long and rutted, lined with dust and stairs. Folks didn't much like Boone. He didn't smile, didn't drink with the men, and he never went to church. But he paid his debts, never raised his voice, and didn't forget a kindness. Boone's ranch was 15 miles west of nowhere. The gate was broken, and the barn leaned like it was tired of holding itself up. But it was quiet, safe. Henry hadn't known a place could feel like that. Boone lifted the calf down, then turned to Henry. "You walk or you ride?" Henry looked down. "I can try." "You'll walk here. On your time. Your way." He said it like a promise, not a rule. Boone opened the barn and led Henry to a corner stall. It smelled of old hay and cedar. There was a wool blanket, patched but clean, folded over a saddle rack. An old tin mug rested beside it. Henry touched the blanket like it might disappear. "I can stay?" "For now," Boone said. Henry nodded and sat. Boone didn't hover. He just set a lantern nearby and said, "If you hear coyotes, don't be scared. They ain't after boys who don't cry." Henry gave a tired smile. Later that night, Boone stood by the door, watching the boy curl into the blanket, knees tucked up, arms around his chest. The calf lay outside under shelter, breathing easy for the first time all day. Boone didn't sleep. He sat near the door, carving a notch into a piece of driftwood. He didn't know why he kept doing that. Maybe for every soul that passed through. Maybe to remind himself who he used to be. In the silence, Henry stirred. "Why'd you take me?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Boone answered without looking. "You looked like someone worth saving." Henry said nothing for a long moment. "They said I'm useless," he whispered, "because I'm lame." Boone looked up, eyes soft but steady. "Then they ain't ever known a man who could stand on one leg and still carry the weight of the world." Henry didn't respond, but when the boy fell asleep again, there were no nightmares. Just the sound of Boone's quiet carving in the dark, and the wind pressing soft against the barn walls like it too had decided to stay a while. By morning, Henry's blanket had been tucked tighter around him, and beside the stall door an extra pair of boots sat worn but polished, with the left one specially cut wider. Just enough to make a boy forget about limping, at least for a while. The morning came heavy with low clouds and the smell of rain waiting to fall. Henry hadn't spoken much. Boone hadn't asked him to. The boy followed behind like a stray colt, still unsure if he was allowed to stay, still not certain the boot he'd been given was truly his. But he walked, dragging that left leg behind him, jaw tight like he refused to limp, harder than he had to. They crossed the field past the back of Boone's barn, down a trail that cut along the riverbed. At the end of it stood a one-story house, built from thick pine logs and painted white long ago. Most of the paint had peeled, but the shutters remained a faded blue, and flower pots lined the railings, though only one still held anything alive. Boone didn't knock. He just stood at the gate, arms crossed, eyes steady. He waited like he always did, patient, still, immovable. The door opened without sound. Esther Lively stood framed in the entryway, a woman in her 40s with the sort of face that looked like it hadn't cried in years but never stopped grieving. She wore a pale blue dress faded at the edges and an apron with a stitched daisy in the corner. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled back in a low knot. She looked at Boone first, then her eyes dropped to the boy. Henry looked away. Esther said nothing. Boone spoke. "He needs feeding." And someone who knows what quiet means. Esther's gaze lingered a moment longer before she stepped aside. Henry hesitated. Boone gave a small nod. Inside, the house smelled like lavender and iron, the kind of place where sorrow had settled like dust, but hadn't yet turned to bitterness. Henry stood just inside the doorway, clutching the edge of his shirt. Esther walked to the table, cut a piece of cornbread, and placed it on a plate. She didn't heat it, didn't butter it. She slid it in front of him, then sat across with her sewing in hand. Henry didn't eat right away. He just stared. The cornbread looked like it had been made for someone else hours ago, maybe days. Esther didn't look up from her stitching. "You can sit," she said, voice low and clear. "If you're tired." Henry sat. Boone remained outside. The only sound in the room was the slow push of needle through cloth and the occasional creak of Henry shifting in his chair. Finally, Esther said, "That shirt won't last through another storm." Henry glanced down. The seam under his arm had split wide. His elbow peeked through a hole worn by years and hard days. Esther set her needle down and walked into the back room. When she returned, she had a thread spool the same dull brown as the shirt, and a thimble already on her finger. "Give it here." Henry hesitated, then slipped the shirt off slowly, embarrassed by the thinness of his arms, the old bruises still fading along his ribs. Esther didn't comment. Her fingers worked quickly, the needle dipping and rising like waves on a calm river. "You're a quiet one," she said. Henry didn't answer. "That's all right." Some folks think talking's the only way to be heard, but silence can say plenty. He blinked at that. It was the kind of thing Boone might have said if he used a few more words. Esther handed the shirt back. The tear was gone. So was the hole at the elbow. She'd added a little patch inside the collar where it rubbed raw. "Thank you," Henry murmured. Esther gave a nod. Not warm, not cold, just enough to say she heard him. Later, as the rain finally started to fall in soft sheets outside, Boone came in, boots dripping. He looked to Henry. "You ready?" The boy hesitated. He looked back at Esther. She was standing at the window now, arms folded, watching the rain. "I don't mind visitors," she said without turning, "so long as they wipe their feet and keep their words honest." Boone tipped his hat and they left. The next day they returned. This time Boone handed Esther a jar of blackberry preserves, and Henry brought a small stick horse he'd carved out of pine as a thank you. Esther took both with the same even expression and said, "There's soup on the stove. Might as well eat." It became a rhythm, quiet meals, mended clothes, a book passed to Henry that he could barely read, but liked the pictures in. Boone didn't stay long on these visits. Sometimes he'd fix a shutter or mend a fence post out back. Sometimes he just waited near the door. One afternoon it came. Henry sat on the back porch steps, watching a squirrel steal from the chicken feed. Esther was folding dry laundry, her fingers nimble even in the chill. Henry said it like he hadn't meant to, like it had broken out of him. "They said I'm useless." "Because I'm lame." The words fell like stones in the space between them. Esther didn't flinch. She folded the last shirt, set it aside, and sat next to him. "I had a student once," she said. "Choctaw boy. Bright as fire, but the others in town, they didn't care about brightness. Just the color of his skin." She clasped her hands together. "I defended him, called out the lies. The school board didn't like that. They called me troublesome, said I was leading children away from good Christian order. Took away my chalk, my desk, and my nameplate." Henry's mouth parted slightly. He hadn't expected that. "They told me I was no longer fit to teach," she went on. "Said a woman like me didn't know her place." She turned and looked him in the eye, voice sharp as a knife slicing dough. "So you listen to me, Henry. When someone calls you useless, it's usually because you remind them of something they lost or never had. That ain't your fault, and it sure as hell ain't your burden." Her fingers curled around his hand, firm but kind. "Then they ain't worth listening to," she whispered. Henry didn't say anything, but the breath he let out was deeper than any he'd taken since Boone found him. That night, when Boone came to walk him home, Henry paused at the porch and looked back. Esther was holding something in her hand. It was a picture frame cracked, old and in it, a photo of a classroom full of children. One of them, a brown-skinned boy, stood in front, holding a wooden ruler, smile wide. Henry watched her tuck it back inside a chest like a sacred thing, and he wondered what it meant that she kept it so close. But before he could ask, Boone spoke behind him. "Pack light in the morning," he said. "We're going to town." "Why?" Boone looked toward the horizon, where the clouds had finally broken, revealing a blood-orange sky over the ridge. "Some folks don't like you livin' free." They aimed to fix that Henry's scream wasn't sharp. It was strangled, ragged, like it got stuck somewhere between his chest and throat. The horse reared just slightly, startled by a flicker of wind or a twitch from Henry's uneven grip, and the boy slipped clean off the saddle. His hip hit the hard-packed dirt first, followed by an awkward twist of his bad leg, and then his elbow caught a jagged rock. Boone didn't rush to him. He waited. Henry rolled onto his side, groaning, tears already building at the corners of his eyes. But he didn't cry out loud, not really. Just sat there, blinking hard, fists balled in the dirt like he hated the ground for winning. "You all right?" Boone finally asked. Henry nodded, then shook his head. "I don't know." "You hurt bad?" "No," the boy croaked. "Just embarrassed, I guess." Boone dismounted with one slow step and crouched beside him. "You're allowed to feel both." The saddle had been adjusted for Henry's twisted foot-shorter stirrup on the left, extra leather under the arch, but riding wasn't a thing you could learn just by wanting it. It took bruises. Boone had 100 of them buried in memory, each one shaped like some kind of lesson. He reached down, offered a hand. Henry took it. Boone pulled him up, brushed dirt from the boy's shoulder, and said, "Get back on." Henry hesitated. Boone didn't push, didn't scold, just nodded once and turned to the horse. "She won't learn from you if you quit on her." With teeth gritted and jaw set, Henry limped back to the saddle and climbed up, slower this time. His hands trembled, but he didn't look away from Boone. They circled the small pasture 3 more times before sunset. Henry fell once more, got up again. By the end of the day, he was riding crooked and clumsy, but he was riding. That night, the wind picked up. Storms on the plains never whispered. They came with noise roof shingles rattling, wind whistling through broken slats in the barn wall, rain slamming like it had something to prove. Henry lay curled in the cot Boone had built for him in the tack room. The chaps Boone no longer wore hung near the door like quiet guards. The saddle Henry trained with sat against the far wall, damp and glinting in the lantern light. Lightning flashed, thunder cracked a breath later. Then another sound, a soft whimper, not from outside. Boone stood at the door. He didn't say anything, just listened. Inside, Henry twisted beneath the quilt, caught in some shadowed dream. "No, don't," he mumbled. "Don't take her, Ma." The boy jolted awake, sitting up fast and gasping. He blinked, dazed, soaked in sweat. Esther was already there. She must have heard from the house. She didn't speak either. She just knelt beside the cot and pressed a damp cloth to his forehead. "I saw her," Henry whispered. "She was bleeding." Esther's hand didn't flinch. "She told me I was fast. She said I ran faster than thunder." He looked up at Esther like he wanted her to fix it, to say the dream wasn't real. But her eyes only softened. "You're safe now," she whispered. Henry reached out slowly, uncertain, and caught the edge of her sleeve. He didn't call her by name. He just said, "Mama?" Esther blinked hard. Something broke quietly behind her eyes. She squeezed his hand but didn't answer. Back in the main house, after Henry had finally drifted off again, Esther stood at the window, staring out toward Boone's barn. Her fingers were still trembling. Boone stood under the awning, a lantern beside him. He was holding something in his hand, turning it over slowly in the light. A pocket watch. Its case was old, the brass dulled with age and rain. Boone clicked it open with his thumb, then stared at the faded photograph inside. A woman smiling, soft-eyed, brown-skinned, held a child barely past toddlerhood. Boone's arm was around both of them. The child's hair curled at the edges like his had once. He closed the watch and slipped it into his vest. Esther had seen the watch before. Never asked, but something about the way Boone looked at it tonight. It carried weight heavier than grief. Later, Boone sat on the porch, boots resting on the lowest step, silence thick around him. The storm had passed. The land was wet, breathing slow under moonlight. He pulled a thin leather journal from his coat and opened to a marked page. The handwriting inside was uneven. A child's. It read, "Dear Mr. Boone, I didn't fall today." "Well, not much. The horse is teaching me. I think you might be teaching her too." Boone smiled faintly, then closed the journal and looked toward the hills. His eyes narrowed. A lone rider was moving in the distance. Small, fast. Wrong direction for ranchers or postmen. And too early for spring travelers. He didn't move, just watched. The wind carried something strange with it now. Not rain, not thunder. Something coming. Something that would not pass quietly. It started with a whisper, the kind that slips under door frames and through church pews, picking up heat with every retelling. A boy, crippled since birth. A widow who hadn't been seen in Sunday service since the flood of 17. And Boone, the giant who never sat at anyone's table but always knew where every grave in this town was dug. They called it suspicious, then unholy, then unnatural. By the time the town meeting was called, half of Sycamore Ridge had an opinion, and most of it stank of self-righteous perfume. Esther knew it would come eventually. She heard it in the baker's too-sweet tone when she handed over bread. She saw it in the glances tossed her way when she walked Henry to the dry goods store. The kind of sideways looks women give each other when they want to feel clean by making someone else dirty. Prudence Talley, head of the Ladies' Improvement Society, came knocking 3 days later. Boone answered the door with a hammer in one hand and a hayseed in his teeth. "Mr. Boone," Prudence said with a smile as thin as her patience. She wore black lace gloves even in the heat, and her brooch glinted like judgment itself. "We need to speak about the child." Boone didn't move, didn't blink. "The boy," she continued, "the one living here. With you and Mrs. Lively. Surely you see how it looks." Boone wiped his hands on a rag, folded it neatly, and stared. Prudence cleared her throat. "The society has concerns. The boy is troubled, and you are hardly equipped to—" Boone raised a hand, not to hit, just to stop her. His voice was low and hard as fence posts sunk deep in red clay. "You want the boy? Only for his own good. There's a facility in Mason Ridge, a school, discipline, scripture. They'll straighten him out." Boone stepped forward until she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "You ever visit that place?" "Well, no, but—" "I have." His jaw tightened. "Boy comes with a bruised soul. You put more fists on top of that, he won't come out a boy at all. He'll come out what this town deserves." Prudence narrowed her eyes. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Boone?" He didn't answer. She left with her skirts rustling behind her, like storm clouds full of gossip. The next day they were summoned to town hall. Judge Horace Langley had been retired for 5 years, but when matters got tricky, when the Ladies' Society began waving papers and the preacher started talking about propriety, folks called Horace out of the dark, like a spirit. Boone, Esther, and Henry walked into the dusty room together. Boone's hat was low, shadowing his face. Henry wore a shirt Esther had ironed 3 times that morning. She held his hand tight. The room was packed. Most folks came to see a show. A few came to see justice. Prudence stood with her arms folded, the picture of righteous concern. "The boy," she said to the judge, "is being kept in a barn, raised without a father or mother, under the roof of a violent man and a woman whose past is checkered at best." Judge Langley leaned back in his chair, long fingers steepled under his chin. "Esther," he said slowly, "what do you have to say?" Esther pulled a folded paper from her apron. Her voice did not shake. 3 years ago, Henry was brought to this town by a man named George Tabor, said he was the boy's stepfather, claimed Henry's mother died of sickness. Gasps circled the room like mosquitoes. He lied. Henry's mother died from a ruptured spleen. Her ribs were broken. His leg. She looked at Henry, whose jaw was set, like Boone's now hard and quiet, was shattered when he tried to protect her. "I have the coroner's letter. I have the signed statements from neighbors." She laid the documents on the judge's table. "And this very council," she added, her voice rising, "refused to press charges because Mr. Tabor was a deacon and because his wife, Henry's mother, was a woman of color." The room turned ice cold. Boone took one slow step forward. Langley turned to him. "You got something to say, Boone?" Boone looked at Henry, then back at the judge. "You break him," he said softly. "I bury you in my silence." Langley's face went still. Prudence scoffed. "That's a threat." "No," Langley said. "That's a truth you don't want tested." The room buzzed with breath held too long. Langley picked up the documents, eyes scanning them without emotion. "You've brought evidence, testimony, and a child with more backbone than most grown men in here." He folded the papers neatly. "This case is closed," Prudence sputtered. "You can't be serious." "I'm old," Langley said, "and tired, and not interested in cleaning up your shame disguised as concern." He banged his gavel once. People filed out slower than they came in. No one met Boone's eyes. Henry stood taller than he had before. Back outside, in the warm dust of the main street, Esther squeezed Boone's hand. "You didn't have to say that to him," she murmured. Boone kept walking, eyes on the road. "Didn't say it for him." Esther looked back once. Prudence was still inside, probably hissing like a snake cornered by its own reflection. Later that night, Henry sat on the porch with a pencil stub and a crumpled scrap of paper. He was trying to write something, though Boone couldn't see what. He finally asked, "Mr. Boone, why do they hate us?" Boone didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, "Because you remind them of something they're trying hard to forget." Henry frowned. "Like what?" Boone lit his pipe and watched the smoke curl up toward the moon. "The truth." Inside the barn, a shadow moved across the far wall. Someone had been watching the meeting. Someone who wasn't supposed to be in town. And he was carrying a badge that wasn't his anymore. The night held still. Not silent, not dead, but still, the way only a western night could be. A low wind brushed through the dry grass like it was telling secrets, and the stars blinked above the ranch like they were waiting on someone to speak first. Boone sat at the fire pit behind the barn, legs stretched, hat resting on his knee. Esther sat beside him with her shawl pulled close, sipping coffee that had long since gone cold. Henry was across from them, toes warming near the flames, a folded piece of paper gripped tight in both hands like it might blow away if he blinked. None of them talked much, which is probably why they all got along. Esther eventually broke the quiet. "You gonna read it or just wrinkle it to death?" Henry bit his lip, eyes darting toward Boone, who hadn't looked away from the fire. I tried. Read it," Boone said softly. "You got the floor." Henry straightened, coughed, then opened the crumpled page and squinted at his own handwriting. His voice was uncertain at first, but steadier with each word. "When I wake up here, it don't feel like before. The wind doesn't scream and the roof don't roar. There's boots by the door and a saddle with dust, a fire that listens and folks I can trust. I used to hide, I used to bend. Now I sleep easy 'cause I've got friends." He looked up, red-faced, waiting. Esther smiled first. Boone didn't say anything. He just reached out, plucked the paper from Henry's hand, folded it carefully, and tucked it into the inside pocket of his vest. "That your way of asking to stay?" he asked. Henry's ears turned bright pink. "Maybe. Then maybe I ought to build you a room that don't smell like horse sweat and paint thinner." Henry blinked. "You mean it?" Boone rose, joints cracking as he stood. "I don't say what I don't mean." They didn't start right away. Boone was never one to rush. But the next morning Henry found him in the old storage shed, marking wood with a piece of chalk. There was already a stack of salvaged boards leaned against the wall, a hammer dangling from Boone's belt. It took 4 days. Esther helped when she could, handing tools, oiling hinges, reusing old curtains from her sewing box to soften the single window that faced west. Henry stayed busy sorting nails by length and sneaking cookies when he thought no one noticed. By the fifth night, it was done. A small room, barely more than a corner carved into the side of the barn, but it had a cot, a shelf, and a door that locked if you wanted it to. Boone even made him a lantern holder shaped like a horse's head. Henry stood in the doorway like he didn't know whether to step in or run away. "You built this for me?" "No," Boone said. "I built it because it was time." "Time for what?" "Time you had something that couldn't be taken from you." Henry stepped inside, turned in a slow circle, then sat on the cot and bounced once. It squeaked like an old mule, but held his weight just fine. Later, Boone sat on the porch, sharpening a knife, Esther reading in the rocker beside him. "You ever wonder," she asked, "why a man like you, someone who don't talk much and don't trust many, would build something like that for a boy who limps?" Boone looked at the firelight dancing across the woodpile. "Because I made a promise once," he said, voice distant, "to protect what most men walk past." Esther watched him closely. "Is that what your tattoo means?" Boone's left sleeve was rolled high. The ink there had faded, but still clear. 2 arrows crossed through a pine branch, surrounded by thorns. "Yeah," he said. "It was a war thing at first. Then it became something else. A vow, I guess. A vow to who?" Boone didn't answer. He just rubbed the scar above his wrist and stared out into the night. That same night, Henry couldn't sleep. He opened the new door gently and stepped barefoot out into the yard. The moon was high and the grass cool underfoot. He stood at the edge of the fence line, looked both ways like he was about to do something forbidden, then dropped the crutch beside him and took a breath. One step, another. He limped forward, slow, off balance, but without support. His arms swung wild for balance, his mouth half open in concentration. Then he picked up speed, a sort of awkward side-leaning jog, a gallop for a boy with one bad leg and too much hope. His foot caught on a rock, and down he went, hard, rolling once in the grass before landing flat on his back. For a second the world held still again. Then Henry laughed. It was loud, full, and cracked at the edges. The kind of laugh only a boy who forgot how to laugh could make. A sound that rose into the sky like it didn't care who heard it. Boone watched from the porch. Esther stood in the doorway, wrapped in her shawl. "He fell," she said, worried. "He ran," Boone replied. In the distance, just beyond the edge of the property, a rider dismounted in the trees, watching. He was pale, dressed in black, with a limp of his own, and he had Henry's last name. The knock on the door came at dawn, hard and deliberate. Boone was already up, feeding the horses and checking the fence line. Esther opened it instead, apron still damp from drying her hands. Henry sat at the table, half a biscuit in his mouth, pencil clutched in hand as he worked on another poem he swore he wasn't writing. The man at the door filled the frame like a shadow stretched long by memory. Leather duster worn thin, spurs unpolished but loud, a beard that barely hid the line of a broken jaw. His eyes were pale watery gray and dead as river stones. "I'm here for the boy," he said. Esther didn't blink. "You've got the wrong house." "No," the man said, stepping forward. "This is Henry Tabor's house." "And I'm his father," Henry froze at the table. His hand dropped the pencil. Biscuit forgotten. Esther didn't move. "You're not his father. You're the man who broke his leg. Watch your tone, missus," he said. "The boy's mine by blood and by law." "You married his mother," Esther said coldly. "You beat her till she couldn't speak, and now you want to finish what you started." He smirked. "She's dead. That chapter's closed. I'm here on account of the Ladies' Society. Prudence Tally herself asked me to step in. They said this boy was being raised by a freak and a fallen woman." Boone's boots hit the porch behind him before the man finished the sentence. Henry looked up just as Boone stepped past the door. The man turned. "Well, hell," he said, squinting. Ain't you a ghost?" Boone said nothing. "Didn't think I'd see you again." Not after Chickamauga Boone's jaw tightened. The man took a slow step forward. "You remember me now, don't you, Boone?" "3rd Georgia Cavalry. You had me by the throat behind a collapsed wagon. I was crying like a child. You let me crawl away." Boone's hand shifted slightly. Not toward his gun, just toward his belt, where his fingers closed into a quiet fist. "I should have killed you then," Boone said. "But you didn't," the man grinned. "Now look at us. You raising my boy, and I'm here to take him back." "He ain't yours," Boone said. "He's got my name." "Then he'll change it." Henry stood behind them now, just inside the doorway. His lips were pressed together so tight his face had gone red. He didn't speak, but he was shaking. The man George Tabor turned toward him. "Henry," he said in a falsely soft voice. "Come on. I know I wasn't perfect, but I'm your kin. These people don't know what you need. I do." Henry took one step backward. Tabor moved. Boone stepped between them so fast the wind off his coat caught Henry's cheek. "I won't tell you again," Boone said, voice low as a distant drum roll. Tabor tilted his head. "Or what? You'll beat me, kill me, in front of the boy." "No." Boone took one step forward. "I'll let you swing first." Tabor chuckled, but his eyes darted. "He ain't yours." Boone stared him down. "You hit him once more," he said, quiet as a loaded gun, "and it won't be God you answer to." Tabor flinched. For a second he looked like he might draw. His hand twitched near his side. Boone didn't move. Henry stepped forward and said, "Steady. I'm not going with you." Esther joined him. "You'll leave this ranch now," she told Tabor. "Or next time you'll need more than a badge you don't wear anymore and a name that nobody respects." Tabor looked at her, looked at Boone, looked at Henry. Then he spat in the dirt, turned, and mounted his horse. "You'll see me again," he growled. "This ain't over." As his horse disappeared into the trees, Esther let out a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Henry collapsed onto the porch steps, wiping his eyes with the back of his sleeve. Boone sat beside him, silent. "I thought he was gone," Henry whispered. "He is," Boone said. "But what if he comes back?" Boone looked out into the horizon, where the morning sun had finally crept up past the edge of the hills. "Then I'll be waiting." Inside the house, Esther closed the door and locked it, her fingers trembling not from fear, but from the memory of what fear used to feel like. And out beyond the trees on the other side of town, Prudence Talley was already preparing her next letter this time to someone higher up than Judge Langley, someone with a badge, someone she could pay. The air inside the town hall was thicker than usual, not from heat, though late spring had curled its fingers deep into the wooden rafters, but from something else. Judgment hung like smoke. Chairs had been arranged into 2 tight rows facing the front dais. Prudence Talley stood beside the judge's bench like she already owned the gavel. She wore black again, same as the day she tried to take Henry the first time. But this time she brought more than words. She brought townsfolk. The Ladies' Society had called for a public review of custody, a polite phrase for something uglier, an auction not of land or cattle, but of a child's place in the world. Esther walked in first, chin high despite the whispers trailing behind her. Henry followed close, face pale, one hand holding the inside of Boone's vest. Boone came last. He didn't nod, didn't smile, just scanned the room with the kind of quiet that always made people sit straighter. Judge Langley had returned to preside again, though his hands trembled slightly as he arranged the papers in front of him. "This hearing," he began, "concerns the well-being and legal guardianship of one Henry Tabor, age 10. Present claimants are Miss Esther Lively and Mr. Elias Boone Langley." Looked up. "Mrs. Talley," You may proceed." Prudence stepped forward, paper in hand, voice honeyed with poison. "Your Honor, we must consider the child's long-term welfare. Mr. Boone has no blood relation to Henry. Miss Lively, while well-intentioned, has a documented history of moral rebellion, dismissed from her school position for insubordination and radical views." Esther's jaw tightened. Prudence kept going. "This boy has been allowed to roam freely with a deformed limb, without schooling, without scripture, in the care of a man who once killed for a living, and a woman who defied her own church." Gasps rippled. Henry flinched. Boone didn't move. Then came the harder words. "This boy, while pitiable, represents a burden. He will grow dependent. He will never marry, never serve the town, never return the investment of food and housing he receives." Esther stood so fast her chair scraped the floor. "You speak of him like he's cattle." "No, Miss Lively," Prudence said with a smirk. "I speak of him like a fact. Love doesn't cure limp legs or remove the weight of law. This is not a home. It is sentiment dressed in defiance." Langley raised a hand. Esther took a deep breath and stepped forward. "May I submit evidence, Your Honor?" He nodded. Esther pulled a small cloth-wrapped bundle from her satchel. Inside was a weathered leather notebook. Boone took it gently, stepped forward, and placed it before the judge. "This is the diary of Amelia Tabor," Esther said. "Henry's mother." Prudence scoffed. "That was never authenticated." "She signed every page," Esther replied, "and Henry can tell you where she hid it under a floorboard." He remembered. Because he was there, Langley opened to the marked page. His lips moved silently as he read. His eyes flicked left, then down. Then he turned another page, and another. His hands stopped shaking. Prudence shifted uncomfortably. Langley looked up. "In these entries," he said, "Mrs. Tabor describes repeated abuse at the hands of George Tabor, including threats to her son's life. She describes Boone's name not in fear, but in hope. Says he once protected her before she was married. Says she wanted to run to him." Boone said nothing. Langley turned to Henry. "Is that true?" Henry stepped forward, hands clenched. "Yes, sir. I remember her voice when she said Boone was the only good man she ever knew." Langley nodded, eyes heavy. "I will take that into account." Prudence wasn't finished. "Your Honor, we still must consider what kind of future this boy has. We're deciding on more than a home. We're deciding on whether we allow rebellion to replace order." Esther didn't respond. Instead, she looked at Henry, nodded once. Henry's lips parted. I wrote something," he said, stepping to the center of the room. Boone watched quietly as the boy unfolded a wrinkled piece of paper. His hands shook. Henry began, voice trembling but loud enough to fill the space. "I was born into noise where walls had fists, where mama's love was cut into lists. Do this, say that. Don't speak, don't run, don't stand by the window, don't look at the sun." Then came a man, who didn't talk much. But he built me a room and a saddle and such. Then came a woman who didn't wear white, but she gave me her hands when I cried at night. So maybe I limp, maybe I fall, but I've stood up more times than most folks at all. Silence. Real silence. Not the kind that waits for the next blow, but the kind that listens. Henry folded the paper and stepped back. Langley leaned back in his chair, his eyes softer than they'd been in years. He lifted the gavel. "The boy stays." The sound of the gavel hitting the wood echoed like thunder rolling over dry plains. Outside, wind lifted the dust in circles, and a hawk screamed high overhead. Inside the hall, Esther reached for Henry's hand and didn't let go. Boone turned toward the back of the room. In the corner, a man stood, arms folded, watching. Not Tabor. A new face. Wore a federal badge clipped to his coat. He nodded once at Boone, then vanished into the crowd before Boone could follow. Esther heard the hammering first. She stepped out onto her porch with a basket of drying sage in her arms and narrowed her eyes toward the western fence line. Boone was out there, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, sweat darkening his collar. He was fixing her fence, not patching, replacing. A whole new stretch of cedar posts, each cut and leveled, lined in tight. The gate she'd been meaning to mend for over a year now swung smooth as butter. She walked down the steps, quiet as always, watching him work. He didn't glance up until the final nail was driven. "You askin' me something, Boone?" she said. He leaned on the post and looked at her, calm as a still pond. "I don't ask much," he said, "but I don't like broken things staying broke when I can fix 'em." She didn't smile, not quite, but her voice warmed. "You mean the fence?" Boone didn't answer. Later that week, Henry came running in with a grin so wide it could have split his face. "Esther, Esther, he's setting up chairs, real ones, like a service." Esther blinked. "What kind of service?" Henry stopped, his chest puffed like he'd just finished a race. "A wedding. Yours, I think." Boone didn't say it, but he started cleaning the old arbor near the stream. "And I saw Miss Nellie from the bakery bring flowers." Esther raised an eyebrow. Boone said nothing the entire time, but the next morning there was a dress folded gently on her bed. Not new, but clean and mended with lace along the hem, and her mother's ring-long thought lost placed carefully beside it in a small wooden box. When she stepped out onto the back porch, Boone was there, waiting. Not in black or gray, but a brown vest pressed over a crisp white shirt. His hair was combed back, hat clean. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. Down by the red stream, the little bend where water cut, smooth through red clay, a few rows of chairs had been set in the grass. Townsfolk who once whispered now stood, hushed and humbled. Some because they'd seen the boy stand against the court. Some because they'd felt shame, and some because, even in the hardened West, folks still believed in second chances. The officiant was an old pastor Boone had once saved from drowning in floodwaters years back. He said little, spoke slow, and let the wind do most of the talking. Esther walked barefoot. Boone met her halfway, his eyes unreadable but full, and it was Henry, in a vest too big and boots nearly tripping him, who walked her the last few steps. He placed her hand in Boone's, then stood beside them, straight, proud, and shaking just a little. When asked if they wished to speak vows, Boone simply turned to Esther and nodded. "I'll build around you," he said, voice gravel-soft. "Always," Esther whispered, "and I'll stand beside you, even when you say not to." The crowd chuckled softly. Henry cleared his throat. "I've got something," he said. They turned. He stepped forward, lips trembling just slightly. Then he looked at the people, every one of them who'd once looked through him, over him, past him. "They said I was useless," he said, "but I built this day." No one laughed. No one dared. He turned back to Boone and Esther. "And I ain't ever seen anything more real than the two of you." The pastor nodded, then lifted the small leather-bound Bible. "Then by the power vested in me, by the land under our boots, and the Lord above our heads, I pronounce you husband and wife." Boone didn't kiss her right away. He just placed his forehead gently against hers, closed his eyes, and breathed. It was more honest than any kiss. The three of them walked back together, hands tangled, steps uneven, but united. That night, Esther set out supper in the newly cleaned kitchen. Boone lit the lanterns. Henry sat with his feet swinging under the table, watching them quietly. Esther looked over. "Well, you finally got yourself a family," she said. Henry didn't answer. He just looked toward the door, where a letter had been slipped beneath the frame. He picked it up, unfolded it slowly. His smile faded. Boone took the paper, eyes scanning fast. "What is it?" Esther asked. Boone folded the letter once, then twice. "Henry's father is filing with the state for full custody," he said, "and he brought a lawyer from Austin." Spring came slow to Sycamore Ridge, the way it always did, timid, testing the air before letting loose. The land warmed by inches. Wildflowers clawed their way up through hard-packed dirt. The creek rose just enough to shimmer. At Boone's place, the fence line stood firm, the barn didn't lean quite as bad, and laughter lived where silence used to. Henry ran with a limp that didn't slow him much anymore. His crutch was now a backup, hung beside the saddle rack like a retired badge. He spent mornings in the forge behind the barn, where Boone had started teaching him to shape iron. "This one's crooked," Boone said, holding up a horseshoe Henry had hammered too hot. "I like crooked," Henry muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "Matches my leg." Boone didn't argue. He just set it aside gently, like it might be useful one day. Out front, Esther had cleared the storage shed and turned it into a little schoolroom. The windows were scrubbed so clean the sunlight poured in like it missed the place. Children sat on wooden benches lined up 2 by 2. No bell, no chalkboard, just Esther's voice and a slate for each. She taught letters and numbers, but also how to listen, how to speak without hurting, how to look someone in the eye when you said thank you. Some of the same boys who once called Henry names now chased him across the pasture, yelling for another turn to ride the old bay mare he'd trained to tolerate chaos. "She don't buck me any more," Henry said proudly to Boone one evening. "That's 'cause she knows you got more fire than she does." Henry looked up. "You mean that?" Boone adjusted the collar on the boy's vest. "Wouldn't say it if I didn't." That night, while Esther swept the front porch and Boone sharpened a rasp in the barn, Henry opened the front door and found something that made him stop breathing. A wicker basket. A baby inside. The child couldn't have been more than a year old. Dark eyes, a knitted cap too big for its head. There was no note, just a blanket and a small wooden carving of a rabbit tucked in beside her. Henry knelt, hands shaking. "Esther!" he shouted. She came running, Boone right behind her. For a second, no one moved. Then Esther stepped forward, lowered herself to her knees, and scooped the child into her arms. The baby blinked up at her, unsure whether to cry. Esther held her close, rocking slowly. "She's warm," she said. "Fed recently." Henry looked around, but the night held no figure in the distance, no hoofprints in the dirt. "Somebody meant for her to land here," Boone said. Esther pressed her lips to the child's head. "Well, she did." Inside, Henry set the table with one extra cup, just in case. The baby didn't cry. She curled into Esther's chest like she belonged there all along. Later, as stars scattered over the dark sky, Henry stood at the window, watching Boone hold the baby for the first time. "You're not scared?" he asked. Boone looked down at the child, tiny hands curled against his shoulder. "Not of this." Henry thought for a moment. "You think she'll remember her old family?" Boone didn't look away from the baby. "I think she'll remember who held her when nobody else did." Henry nodded slowly. "So, she's ours now." Esther, now seated beside the stove, looked up. "She's whoever she wants to be," she said. "But if she wants us, she's home." The room settled into something deeper than comfort, something like roots. Boone poured water into a kettle. Esther rocked the baby beside the fire. Henry scribbled a line into a new poem, scratching out words, then adding them back. Outside, down by the edge of the woods, a figure watched the house. He didn't approach. He just stood there, a piece of folded paper in his hand, wearing a coat that didn't quite fit and a hat pulled low. Then he turned, slow and deliberate, and began the long walk back to town, where a courtroom waited, and a judge who owed him a favor. The first rays of morning cut through the fog like a slow blinking eye. Out past the red stream, over a stretch of golden grassland, a hammer clinked against wood. Henry stood barefoot in the dew, sleeves rolled, tongue pressed to the corner of his mouth as he painted the last letters. He stepped back, brushed his hands on his trousers, and read it out loud. The Boone Lively Home. Beneath it, in smaller letters, for the unwanted, the brave, and the found. Boone stood behind him, arms folded across his chest. Esther watched from the porch, the baby nestled in one arm, eyes still drowsy from sleep. "You like it?" Henry asked, stepping aside. Boone studied the sign, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, he reached into the pocket of his vest and pulled out something wrapped in a piece of oilcloth. He handed it to Henry without a word. Henry unwrapped it carefully. A brass pocket watch, worn smooth by time. He clicked it open. Inside was a faded photo creased, nearly rubbed to ghost, but still clear enough to see. A black woman with soft eyes holding a toddler. Boone, young and rough around the edges, stood just behind them, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Henry's breath caught. Boone said, "That boy's name was Isaiah." He didn't get the years he should have. Henry looked up, confused. "That watch was his?" "No," Boone said. "It was mine. But I never gave it to anyone. Not until now." Henry turned the watch over in his hands, gently tracing the initials carved on the back EB. Boone's eyes were steady. "It's yours now." Esther came down the steps, barefoot, hair pulled back in a loose braid. The baby slept against her chest. Boone nodded toward the horses already saddled at the fence. "Ride with us," he said. Henry blinked. "Where are we going?" Boone shrugged. "Wherever we want." They mounted together, Boone on his dark gelding, Esther on the gray mare, Henry on the old bay he'd trained himself. He tucked the watch into his shirt pocket, straightened his back, and tried to ignore the lump in his throat. They rode slow, the sun behind them casting long shadows that stretched across the prairie like open arms. Boone pointed toward the ridge. "Once we cross that, there's a little valley. Clean water, flat ground. Might be good for planting," Esther smiled. "Might be good for raising more than crops." They reached the top just as the sky turned gold. Henry stopped his horse, looking out across the open land. The breeze caught his shirt, made his hair lift. He placed a hand over the watch in his pocket. "They said I'm useless," he whispered. Then he looked down at the earth, freshly kissed by morning, stretching wide and endless before them. "But this land says otherwise." They rode on, the wind at their backs, the future somewhere beyond the next hill. And back at the ranch, nailed firm into a cedar post, the sign stood in the morning light, facing the road, waiting for whoever might need it next. The Boone Lively Home, for the unwanted, the brave, and the found. In the untamed West, some homes aren't built from timber, but from second chances and quiet promises. More stories are waiting beyond the horizon. Subscribe to Western Legacy so you don't miss the next ride.